Well, the Hong Kong government has withdrawn the extradition bill that sparked all these protests that we've been seeing over the last couple of months. It's been a while now, but initially the protests were over the fear that this new extradition bill could allow the Hong Kong government to extradite people to China and essentially throw them into gulags, and this would be, of course, the death of freedom in Hong Kong, because if you criticized anything that the Chinese government did, the fear was then that the government would just ship you off to a gulag in China, and you would lose that sort of one country, two systems protection to where there's a separate legal system in Hong Kong and versus mainland China. But the bill that sparked these protests, that's kind of well back into the memory, I think, of the protesters at this point, because the protest has taken on such a greater meaning than simply a resistance against the extradition bill. But interestingly enough, the extradition bill actually isn't still active. It really isn't a current threat, because Carrie Lam, the leader of the Hong Kong government, already sort of withdrew the bill. They stopped the legislative process of advancing it without formally withdrawing the bill. So the bill was pretty much dead, and she said that as much on TV. She said, yeah, we're not passing this bill anymore. It's not going anywhere. But they didn't strike it from the legislative agenda, I guess is how you would put it. But that's what they've done here. So in essence, what this move has been is really just a formality. They're saying, yeah, the extradition bill as written is off the table forever. Now, of course, they could always reintroduce it later on down the line if they felt like it. But as of right now, the bill does not exist. We are essentially back to the status quo ante. Now, to me, this looks like a huge victory for the protesters, because if you may recall back to when Carrie Lam officially stopped pushing to have the bill passed back, gosh, how many weeks ago was it at this point? The protesters demanded immediately, well, then just withdraw the whole bill, because we don't trust you. You can just restart the legislative process at any time. Get rid of the bill. Why has the bill not been withdrawn if you don't plan on, getting rid of it? And they wanted more and more. And she said at the time, oh, we're not going to give you all that. And, of course, now she's given in to their previous demands. But, of course, she set the precedent now that, okay, if she gives the protesters something and they demand more, eventually she'll give in and give them what they want. So the protesters can, as long as they keep protesting, can keep asking for more and more, and they can really sort of extract what they want out of Carrie Lam. At this point, if I were a protester, I would really be starting to smell a lot of blood in the water. And it would look to me like Carrie Lam is eating out of the palm of my hand. So if I were out there in the streets every week, potentially getting hit with water cannons or pepper spray, I wouldn't be so quick to give up now that she's formally withdrawn the extradition bill that may have gotten me out into the streets initially, because at this point, I would like to take advantage of this strategic position that we've got, considering that, if I were from the perspective of the protesters, they have the higher ground at this point. They should try and take as much as they can get out of this situation. It's not too often that you see the Chinese communists or their allies in a position of weakness vis-a-vis their subjects. And so for that reason, I don't think that this is going to quell the protesters. I don't know what the Hong Kong government is thinking, and I assume they're working in close cooperation with Beijing, but it would seem to me that perhaps they expect withdrawing the extradition bill formally will somehow de-escalate the protests and will perhaps get a lot of people who are out on the streets purely because they're upset about the extradition bill, give them one less reason to be out there, and then perhaps you'll get a lot of marginal protesters who will drop off, and that the more extreme pro-independence people who we see so much on TV and who are the loudest voices in the protests, perhaps they're not actually the majority, and that the silent majority within the protest movement are really just people who cared about this extradition bill but are otherwise very happy living under Chinese rule. Frankly, I doubt that that's the case. I don't think that you have all this passion simply over the extradition bill. I've heard less and less about that in recent weeks. Sure, at first, that was what it was all about. But I think that was just the spark that ignited a lot of people's furor at the government over long-standing issues. There are, regardless of whether the extradition bill exists or not, the Chinese are still encroaching more and more on the rights of the people in Hong Kong, and I think that there is a substantial portion of the population that has had enough of that. And so now that the fire's been lit, I don't think that removing the kindling will be what will put it out. You have to actually pour some cold water over the fire if you want to put it out. I think at this point, if you really, the only thing that the government could give up to the protesters that would actually calm them without the protesters having to really be suppressed with force would be if they got some kind of near full independence, something akin to what Australia and Canada got from the United Kingdom. Eventually, the United Kingdom, the Parliament essentially wrote the local governments there a blank check and said, hey, you can pretty much do whatever you want now, even though Elizabeth is still the Queen. China could do something similar with Hong Kong and say, hey, you guys can do whatever you want now, as long as Xi is still the president there, if only in name. But as of right now, I don't think that's anything that Beijing is willing to do in the near future. Things like universal suffrage and total free elections, without anyone being thrown and kidnapped and arrested for having wrong opinions. I don't think that is going to be something that is on the table yet. But the protests, I think, will continue, and so perhaps eventually that will become a more realistic idea, just as the idea of withdrawing the extradition bill has become very realistic. Remember that the Russian Revolution started over a desire of the soldiers no longer to fight in World War I. They weren't necessarily crying out for communism, they were crying out for an end to the war, but eventually what they ended up with was the Soviet Union, because things kept escalating. I think that perhaps future historians will say something similar about the extradition bill, that it sparked a bit of a political revolution in the minds of the people in Hong Kong. But with that said, why did the government exactly withdraw the extradition bill? Why did they think this was a good idea? And I would have to imagine that Beijing consented to this before Carrie Lam went ahead and did it. But what is the strategy here? Is it really just that they thought they could get rid of marginal voters, or marginal protesters, rather? Did they really think that getting rid of the extradition bill would just take the winds out of the sails of the protest movement and allow them to just sort of ignore it and allow the protests to dissipate over time without actually doing anything? Because to me, I think that's a very naive strategy at this point. Now, granted, we have not seen how this bill's, the withdrawal has affected protest attendance yet. We'll be looking for that in the future. I think that this next weekend will probably be very interesting, because all the people who will be out protesting this time will be out exclusively for non-extradition bill related causes, i.e. the cause of greater self-determination and potentially full independence. And so I will keep my eye on that and see how it goes. If you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.